Australia, the sixth largest country on Earth. An ancient, rugged, and unforgiving land with abundant animal life, both beautiful and deadly. Found within its awe-inspiring landscapes and natural beauty exists a deep history of unexplained mysteries for anyone with the courage to investigate them. Tonight, we join Ben on a journey across this vast island continent in search of answers to events that have reshaped the lives of so many that have been exposed to Unexplained Phenomena Australia. With your host, Ben Hurl.
G'day everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unexplained Phenomena Australia. For those of you who watch regularly, you might see me in a bit of a different location. Had some computer problems this week and the laptop's not working. So I've come in early to my place of employment and I'm going to record the show here before work commences today. So it's around about 6 o'clock in the morning here, local time. And it's very dark out and there was lots of stars, winter down here in Australia. So yes, very dark but clear. And I was looking up in the sky and just trying to see if I could see anything at all. And all I can really see this morning was just stars low on the horizon. And when you're seeing stars low on the horizon, they tend to flicker through that green, blue, red color, green, blue, red color. So a lot of UFO reports come up like that. And they tend to be on the horizon. Sometimes they're stars, particularly if they're not moving. So, but a beautiful morning out there just the same, cold. And I thought for this week's episode, we would have a look at Pine Gap. Yes, that's right. You may have heard of Pine Gap. You may not have heard of Pine Gap. But Pine Gap is a secret military installation that is located in the dead centre of Australia. And it's garnered a lot of controversy over the years. And it's a very interesting story as well about how it came into being, what it actually does. And I think like Area 51, it kind of generates its own pop culture around it as well, although nowhere near the extent of Area 51. Area 51 being probably the most famous secret base on the planet. But Pine Gap isn't far behind it, particularly if you are living in the Southern Hemisphere like here. And I dare say most Americans probably don't know that much about Pine Gap either. Pine Gap is, if you're into military and government secrets and UFOs, then perhaps you would have heard of Pine Gap. But your average person out there in the street probably wouldn't think about it on a day-to-day level. And it is, one thing you have to say for Pine Gap is it is extremely isolated, but not at the same time. It's only about 12 miles from Alice Springs. So it's not isolated from a town per se, whereas Area 51 is a reasonable drive outside of Las Vegas and I've been there, to get there, a couple of hours to get out there, whereas Pine Gap is only 12 miles to the west of Alice Springs being the central city in central Northern Territory. So it's close to civilization, but its location is very, very strategic in where it is. I'm going to bring up a little map that's going to show you exactly where Pine Gap sits. So this map here shows you where that red dropper is. That's where Pine Gap is located. Now, the importance of that is that central location. It's almost in the dead centre of Australia, almost, not quite, but very close. The important thing about Pine Gap is that, and the reason why it's there is it's very hard for spy ships to pick up any of its signals being located that deep into the Australian continent. So there's a very good reason for where it is while it's there. And like Area 51, you can't get close to it. So most people don't get within, a kilometre of the facility, probably at the closest you could get to it. Whereas Area 51 is even more restricted than that. You're miles from it. Even when you get to the front gates of Area 51, you're miles from any of the action. It's still good to go there though. And I haven't been to Pine Gap. It would be on my wish list when I eventually get that opportunity to go to Pine Gap and check it out. And the signs, you'll see signs like this, which you see signs like that over at Area 51 as well. So obviously the no through road, Joint Defence Facility Pine Gap, official entry only, no photographs from this point on. And I like the turn around now symbol. I think that's quite, if you can't read the sign, then look at the symbol. The symbol's going to tell you that you need to turn around and head back the way you came. So and I've got another photo of it too, or a couple of photos of the actual facility. So this is what people see as Pine Gap. So it's got the big radones, which are the big receiving towers there. They look like golf balls, obviously. And it's quite a space-looking sort of a place. It looks like an advanced facility, which it certainly is. And here's a really lovely photo of Pine Gap as well, which is an ABC News photo. So that was taken on a rather lovely desert evening. So there you can see what I'm actually talking about. Pine Gap is this facility deep in the heart of the desert in Central Australia. Now, what is it? Why is it there? So the facility consists of a massive computer complex, and it has about 38 of those big golf balls or radomes, which are projecting radar dishes. That's actually what's in there, in those big golf balls, is radar dishes. And it operates with anywhere between 800 to 1,000 employees. So the location, it also controls United States spy satellites as they pass over 1/3 of the globe. 1/3 of the globe, including China, the Asian parts of Russia, so sort of like Eastern Russia, and the Middle East. And Central Australia was chosen because it is just that too remote. And if you've got spy ships in international waters, they're not going to intercept the signals. They'll be just too weak. And interestingly, also about Pine Gap, is it's become a major part of the local Alice Springs economy. So it's very central to Alice Springs and its thrive and survive, in addition to tourism. So what's the operational history of Pine Gap? So in 1966, during the Cold War, a joint United States and Australian treaty called for the creation of a US satellite surveillance base to be located in Australia. And they called it Joint Defence Space Research Facility. And the purpose of the facility was initially referred to in public as space research. Operations started in 1970, so it took 4 years to get it up and running. And about 400 American families moved to Central Australia, which must have been a shock coming from all over America to the desert wastelands around Alice Springs. So the facility has processing stations for geocentric satellites engaged in signals intelligence collection. So, and there's 4 categories of signals that the base collects: telemetry from advanced weapons development, such as ballistic missiles, used for arms control verification, signals from anti-missile and anti-aircraft radars, transmissions intended for communications satellites, and microwave emissions such as long-distance telephone calls. So it's really a big listening station there. So the operation contains 3 sections: the satellite station keeping section, the signals processing station, and the signals analysis section, from which Australians were actually banned until 1980. So even though it operated in 1970, Australians couldn't even get in there, and that's authorised Australians, not the public, until 1980. And Australia is now officially barred only from the National Cryptographic Room. So, and similarly, Americans are banned from the Australian Cryptographic Room. So each morning, the Joint Reconnaissance Schedule Committee meets to determine what the satellites will monitor over the next 24 hours. So they have a daily meeting about who they're going to spy on today. And with the closing of the Nurungar base in 1999, an area in Pine Gap was set aside for the United States Air Force's Control Station for Defence Support Program. Satellites that monitor heat emissions from missiles, giving first warning of ballistic missile launches. In 2004, the base began operating a new satellite system known as the Space-Based Infrared System, which is a vital element of US missile defense. Now, since the end of the Cold War, the station has mainly been employed in to intercept and record weapons and communication signals from countries in Asia, such as the obvious ones, China and North Korea. And the station was active in supporting the wars in Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, and Iraq, and every US war since the September 11 attacks. So the Menwith Hill Station in the UK is operated by the NSA and also serves as ground station for these satellite missions over in England. And one of Pine Gap's primary functions is to locate radio signals in the Eastern Hemisphere, with the collected information fed into the US drone program. This was confirmed by an NSA document from 2013, which said that Pine Gap plays a key role in providing geolocation data for intelligence purposes, as well as for military operations, including airstrikes. So it's a very vital part of the American defense and spy system. So on 11th of July 2013, documents revealed through former NASA analyst Edwin Snowden show that Pine Gap, among 3 other locations in Australia and 1 in New Zealand, contribute to the NSA's global interception and collection of internet and telephone communications, which involves systems like X-Key Score. Pine Gap intercepts electronic communication from Australian citizens, including phone calls, emails, and faxes. Faxes, even faxes, as a consequence of the technology that it uses. So when you're on your phone, if you're listening in Australia, your call and your emails could be passing through the massive Pine Gap system, which is also known as Echelon as well. Now, according to documents published in August 2017, Pine Gap is used as ground station for spy satellites on 2 secret missions. Mission 7600, with 2 geosynchronous satellites to cover Eurasia and Africa, and Mission 8300, with 4 geosynchronous satellites that cover the former Soviet Union, aka Russia, China, South Asia, East Asia, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and countries on the Atlantic Ocean. Everybody, basically. So now, as I said earlier in the introduction, Pine Gap has created a lot of controversy in Australia. I'm just going to drink a coffee, being so early in the morning. And Gough Whitlam, the Prime Minister of Australia, who was in power between 1972 and 1975, before he was famously kicked out by the Governor General, he considered closing the base. So that was, and it's had lots of protesters there during that time. So over the years, there's been lots of protesters around Pine Gap, and it's been very controversial. So Victor Marchetti, a CIA officer who had helped run the facility, said that this consideration caused a lot of problems in the White House, with Gough Whitlam considering closing it down, and a kind of chilly coup was set in motion, with the CIA and MI6 working together to get rid of the Australian Prime Minister. So he wasn't kicked out by accident, really. The CIA got involved in Australian politics. So on the 11th of November 1975, the day Whitlam was scheduled to brief the Australian Parliament on the secret CIA presence in Australia, as well as it being the last day of action if an election of any kind was to be held before Christmas, he was dismissed from office by the Governor-General, John Kerr, using reserve powers described as archaic by critics of that decision. So, yes, it did create a lot of controversy. It cost an Australian Prime Minister his position. So it's really very controversial. Now, I alluded to protests, and on the 11th of November in 1983, Aboriginal women led 700 women to Pine Gap Gates, where they fell silent for 11 minutes to commemorate Remembrance Day and Greenham Common protests in Britain. Now, this was the beginning of a 2-week women's-only peace camp organised under the auspices of Women for Survival. The gathering was non-violent, but several women trespassed onto the military base, and 111 women were arrested on one particular day, and they all gave their names as Karen Silkwood, an American nuclear worker who died after campaigning for nuclear safety. There you go. I didn't know that. And there were allegations of police brutality, and a Human Rights Commission inquiry ensued. So, moving through time, another protest was on the 5th to the 7th of November 2002, perhaps in more recent times. A numerous group, including Quakers and the National Union of Students, gathered at the gates of Pine Gap to protest the use of the base in the then impending Iraq War, which it was certainly used in. And in December 2005, 6 members of the Christians Against All Terrorism group staged a protest outside Pine Gap. 4 of them later broke into the facility and were arrested, and their trial began on the 3rd of October 2006 and was the first time that Australia's Defence Act 1952 was used, the first time. The Pine Gap 4 cross-appealed, as they were called, the Pine Gap 4, to have their convictions quashed. And in February 2008, the 4 members successfully appealed their convictions and were acquitted. You'd have to say that they got pretty lucky. So you can see, and the thing is, it is literally, while it's isolated, it's just so close to Alice Springs. So these protesters can easily gather in Alice Springs, get themselves together, get a couple of cars, drive the 12 miles out there, and sit at the gates. So it doesn't achieve very much, in my opinion, those type of protests. But people are entitled to do what they want to do in a free democratic country. But you're not allowed to go onto the grounds. That's where they draw the line. Can't do that. So it's also popped up in popular culture over the years as well. So Pine Gap featured in a 2018 Australian television series called Pine Gap. And the series is basically a political thriller portraying the lives of the members of the Joint American-Australian Intelligence Team. So it's in The Secret History of Twin Peaks by Mark Frost. President Richard Nixon claims that Pine Gap is actually the site of an underground facility constructed by extraterrestrials. And in Australia, if you know the Australian band Midnight Oil, in 1982, they released The Power and the Passion, which contains a very popular or well-known reference to Pine Gap in popular culture through that song. So if you don't know it, Google it, Power and the Passion, Midnight Oil. It is a terrific song, and they have a reference to Pine Gap in that. So if you are watching from America and you haven't seen that before, heard that song before, anyone in Australia would certainly have heard it. Definitely put it onto your playlist. It's very, very catchy. So what about UFOs? What about UFOs down in Pine Gap? It's a bit of a murky area finding credible information. But there are stories, there are tales of encounters of UFOs, even aliens, at Pine Gap. But verification is almost impossible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you some information that I've been able to find online about UFO activity at Pine Gap. So there's an organisation called Fortress Australia, Hidden Agenda, and a report was given to the publishers of a paper called RM News, the year it was written in 1996. And the source who delivered it to the group would not state who the author of it was. So this is where things get very hard to verify. They really do. There's no one standing up saying, this is what happened. This is my experience. It's very hard to get that with Pine Gap. So we'll just talk about what's out there to be spoken about. So now this Fortress Australia, this comes at Pine Gap from a slightly different perspective. So the stuff I was talking about before is really essentially just general information that's available on Pine Gap. But this site takes a slightly different view of it. And what we're going to say about it is the UFO sightings that have occurred there, according to this report, and there's it probably lists about 5 or 6 reports of UFOs around Pine Gap. So one case, which received some limited publicity in about 1989, involved 3 hunters who were on an all-night shooting trip in the hills near Pine Gap. At around 4:30 a.m., they observed a large camouflage door open on the side of a low hill inside the security compound, and a metallic circular disc appeared from the gaping black hole, tipped on its edge like that, and disappeared vertically at tremendous speed. This is a group of hunters who were out there on that night. Now, this door then slowly shut and everything returned to normal. The camouflage was so good that from their vantage point, they were unable to observe anything unusual about the area after the door closed. So similar to Area 51. So the Papoose Lake area where there's meant to be those doors that open and close in Area 51. So nothing was noticeable once the door had closed. Now, there are several other incidents of a similar nature which were reported by visitors to the area. And in one case, in 1975, the occupants of a passenger plane, which was passing about 18 miles to the east of the base, observed a large white object, similar in size to one of the white radomes, the big golf balls. And this large white object suddenly leapt into the air and disappeared rapidly towards the northwest. Now, as everyone on the plane was interested in seeing what Pine Gap looked like, most of the passengers and crew saw this strange object. Now, when the pilots reported the incident, everyone on the plane was interviewed and told not to talk about the experience. A camouflage door case occurred in 1980 when 2 members of the Northern Territory Police, who were taking part in a search for a missing Alice Springs child, watched as 3 bathtub-shaped objects flew slowly over the Pine Gap base, and then one by one, they disappeared into an oblong black hole in a hillside. This also occurred during the early hours of the morning, and as the two police officers had arranged to meet other members of the search party, they left without seeing the door close. And that's an interesting report, apparently from Northern Territory Police. There's another sighting which is really quite interesting as well. Just have a quick drink. So now this sighting is completely different again, and it involves blue, red, and gold pencil-like beams. Now, in 1973, so the base had only been operational for 3 years at this time. 3 years the base had been operational. No Australians at the base in 1973. A government cartographer was camped in an area near Pine Gap. And sometime after midnight, he saw a vertical shaft of a very bright blue light emanating from the area of the base. He decided to take a closer look at this bright blue light. He drove his four-wheel drive to the top of a low hill from which the Pine Gap base could be seen, and it was some 8 miles further to the east of his location. Now, there was a full moon, so the big white redomes could be seen quite easily and clearly with the naked eye. Taking a closer look through his 12 power binoculars, he could see most of the base as well as a strange looking object, apparently hovering above it at a height he estimated to be around 1,000 feet. Now, first of all, he thought it was a cigar-shaped balloon, or maybe a blimp, a zeppelin, something like that. But this idea quickly evaporated when the object slowly tipped to a 45-degree angle, and at this point he saw what appeared to be its top surface to the now somewhat surprised observer. It was clear that the object was perfectly circular with a central dome, as the bottom edge was still around it. So, very interesting report. 1,000 feet above the base, the cartographer, he estimated the diameter of the disc to be little more than half the distance between the Pine Gap base and the disc's bottom edge, making it between 500 to 600 feet in diameter. So this is a big object. In the moonlight, the disc appeared to be a dull grey colour with a slightly yellow fuzz around its edge. Now, as he watched, a thin blue beam, like a rod, slowly extended from the disc down to the base. The strange thing about it was that, unlike a flashlight, it did not just turn on. It slowly moved in a telescopic fashion from the disc and gradually extended behind the big white redomes. Now, a few minutes later, the light beam retracted, only to be followed by a similar blue beam slowly extending from the base to the disc. That's interesting. I've never heard of that before. This was followed by a gold-coloured beam, which appeared very close to the blue one. After about 30 seconds, both beams retracted back into the base. 1973. Sounds very high-tech. So this process, observed by the cartographer, continued for about 40 minutes and ended when the disc made some rapid oscillations, lit up like a neon sign, and slowly ascended vertically, not slowly, it ascended vertically at very high speed, disappearing in but a few seconds. What a strange sight to see out in the desert of Pine Gap. So the cartographer reported the incident to his superior officer in Alice Springs. Now, this resulted in what he later described as a grilling by some very officious people who warned him to keep silence about his experience. Otherwise, he would be in for some very real trouble. He was also told that he had not seen anything, and to remember that if he spoke about it, he would be in serious, serious trouble. So, by telling his superior, that obviously went further up the chain, or it got to the security people, and he was basically intimidated. So that was 1973. Now, a more complex sighting involving 5 witnesses occurred in 1984. Now, the leader of this group was a technical expert with a West Australian government department who had received persistent reports, not an occasional report, a persistent report from colleagues of intensive UFO activity around Alice Springs and Pine Gap. He was told that between certain dates, something big was going to happen. Now that sounds mysterious, doesn't it? Something big was going to happen. The information was so intriguing that he decided to mount a clandestine or secret expedition to Central Australia. And to approach Pine Gap from the west through the Gibson Desert and the McDonnell Ranges. So this is someone from the West Australian government, a state government level, going into the Northern Territory, which isn't even his territory. So I don't know what that says as well, being out of your jurisdiction. So they used 2 specially prepared 4-wheel drives. And once in the area of the McDonnell Ranges, they travelled only at night in an effort to reduce the chances of being detected. Now, after reaching Pine Gap, they concealed the vehicles and positioned themselves in an elevated area which overlooked the base at a distance of about 10 miles. So they're about 10 miles out from the base. And look, in the desert too, like it's pretty clear out there. So I'm sure if you've got binoculars and things, you can probably pick up quite good visuals, even at that sort of a distance. You haven't got a lot of smog. You haven't got a lot of, obstructions in the desert. It's pretty clear. Now, they also had with them several small-size astronomical telescopes, and they had no difficulty in gaining a good view of the base area. Now, for the first 2 days and nights, very little happened. So they're out there for 2 days, not much happening. The base is just going about its business. They'd see the occasional movement of small vehicles, a few people, everything was quiet. So the group was becoming a little bit impatient, but decided to sit it out for at least a week in the hope that they would see something interesting. Now, during the evening of the 4th day, they noticed some unusual activity developing in the main base area. A number of vehicles were moving around the base, and what appeared to be groups of people dressed in overalls were gathering at various points near the big white radomes, or the golf balls. Suddenly, a bright beam of gold-coloured light sprang up from the centre of the radome area. A big, bright beam of gold light, which we've seen in that previous report. This was not a pencil-like beam, but seemed to be several metres in width and extremely intense. The width of the beam appeared to remain the same as far as it could be seen, extending vertically into the sky. When observed through the telescope, it looked almost solid light. As they watched, long uneven clouds developed in the clear air surrounding the beam, which, despite a breeze blowing at the time, remained quite stationary. Now, this beam suddenly cut off, and the tubular cloud started to drift to the east like a vertical vapor trail. The beam pulsed several times, and each time it did so, the cloud effect returned, even forming what looked like a series of smoke rings. Very strange. No one in the group could explain why, but they all felt extremely disturbed by what they had just seen, even to the point of nausea. But the show had only just started. The gold beam of light shot down, and once again, the dirty-looking clouds started drifting away. It was at that point that the group noticed 5 star-like objects approaching from the south. As they drew closer, 4 of the objects were seen to be in a tight diamond-shaped formation, and the 5th, which looked like a cylinder, was following at a distance of about 2 miles. The objects slowed as they reached the base. The 4 smaller objects took up positions north, south, east, and west of the base, each moving in small circles. The cylindrical shape, which appeared white in colour with a bright white halo around its centre, moved forward towards the base, reducing altitude to about 500 feet in the process. Now, the cylindrical object stopped and rocking up and down like a boat at its moorings. I'll get my hand into the picture. Once in position, the blue light beam started flashing between all 5 objects and the ground, like this sequence of lights flashing between each of the objects and down to the ground. The whole scene was more than bizarre, as it appeared that the extraterrestrial craft were in direct communication with the human occupants of the base below them. Now, apparently, the whole episode was recorded on videotape and 35mm still film. So, as this was virtually a case of a government department spying on a foreign friend, nothing has been released, and it almost will never see the light of day to us, the interested public. So this scene continued for about 5 minutes. Then one of the small objects rapidly descended towards the base and appeared to land at its northern end. It remained there for 17 minutes and then returned to its original position east of the base and approximately 1,000 feet from the ground. The gold light beam again emanated from the area of the big white radomes. Now this time, the small objects began to rotate around the beam. So they're rotating around the beam and ascending vertically as if they were examining the beam of light coming up from the ground at Pine Gap. The cylindrical object remained in its position, bobbing up and down as before. The 4 objects then returned, spiraling down the beam and returning to their previous positions. The clouds were thickening around the light beam and looked like a long, thin lonic column, or just a long, thin column, might be the way to say it. Now, the beam was turned off on the ground, and once again, the greyish cloud broke up and drifted towards the east. In a jerking motion, the cylindrical object started to gain altitude, stopping in proximity to the smaller objects, which had reformed their diamond-shaped formation. Very interesting. The group then moved off in a southerly direction and disappeared in all but a few seconds. Now, the witnesses were very shocked by what they had seen, and it seemed obvious to the witnesses, the West Australian government team, if you like, that there was human cooperation with extraterrestrials. It also seemed strange to them that despite the strict security, they were able to get reasonably close to it without interference. I guess that's one of the good things about Pine Gap. It's relatively accessible. So I don't know what it's like now in 2023. I don't know if you can get that close to it now. I mean, I live in Victoria, and the Northern Territory is a long way from where I am. But it's not like Area 51, which is like hidden behind high mountain ranges. It's not like that. It is very close to the city of Alice Springs, and I think you can get a reasonable view of it from certain locations. But those locations could be closed now too. I mean, you probably need to talk to someone who's been out that way recently. So now, perhaps no one would have believed the witnesses anyway and declared their photographic evidence as a hoax. However, that didn't seem that logical, as good security is maintained when there is no evidence at all and when no explanations of a program or ridicule is necessary. Yet all of this was happening in front of them and only about 15 miles, again, from Alice Springs. Now, perhaps what they had seen was a vital experiment, and such open exposure was unavoidable from time to time. And I find that interesting, that, if it's a vital experiment going on and you just can't hide that stuff. And I imagine they choose to do it at a time when they believe that there's not likely to be anyone around. Now, they've probably got sensors and things out there and all that can detect anyone within quite a range of the base. But at the time of this encounter, they were 10 miles out. So, maybe they just got extremely lucky, and this is an unavoidable experiment that had to be done, and you just can't hide it. Interesting. So the group spent the next few days observing the base, both day and night, and apart from helicopters and other small aircraft, they observed at least 7 other UFOs in the area. 7 other UFOs in the area. One of the witnesses described the experience as making his skin crawl every time he thought about it. Made his skin crawl. So after leaving the area, they took a circular route around the base and then drove down the main highway to Alice Springs. As it looked like they had travelled from Darwin, no one took any notice of them. After arranging the rail transport of the 2 4-wheel drives back to Perth, they left by plane the next day. They all agreed that the incident had changed their view of all things in general, but it had in some way also disgusted them, as they now knew their government had lied to them from the start and done so in cooperation with the United States. So one of the witnesses says, does this all mean that there's been a working cooperation between extraterrestrials and earthbound governments for a long period of time? The answer is a simple yes. So what do you make of that? I mean, that's a completely unverifiable encounter. So I don't know who these witnesses are. This is just information that I've found talking about UFO encounters in the Pine Gap area. So there's no way of knowing whether that's a true story or not. But it's a very interesting story. And what it explains is almost like, I'm not saying you couldn't make that up, but it does seem like something that that potentially might occur out there. Maybe not every day. You could probably go out, sit there and stare at Pine Gap for weeks on end and nothing happens. It's like everything with paranormal and UFOs. You've just got to be there at the right time. You only catch a big fish in the lake when you're there at the right time, despite the fact that he's there every other day. So, and I hadn't heard of this encounter until I started doing research for this episode last night. So I thought, wow, that's really sort of complex stuff going on directly above the skies of Pine Gap. And if it's a government spying on a government, then, hey, that happens every day too. So now there's another area that is very close to Pine Gap, and it has also attracted a lot of attention. Now, this is a mountain, and the mountain is called Mount Zeal. And it happens to be the tallest mountain west of the Great Dividing Range and the highest peak in the Northern Territory, which is generally pretty flat. So, and the elevation of Mount Zeal, it's not that high. It's about 1,531 meters. Well, that was specific. 1,531 meters, or 1,500 meters above sea level. And it's about 900, looms about 900 meters above the surrounding plains. So now you can drive to a day parking area, which is situated about a 1.5 kilometre walk to the north side of the mountain. And this information has kind of come from like a hiker's sort of a forum. And they say that's a suitable point for climbers to start climbing. So Mount Zeal is located in the West MacDonald National Park, and there is no tracks up it. You don't follow a good old national parks walking trail with a zigzag up the mountain with stop points and little benches to sit on when you get a bit tired. There's no paths up Mount Zeal, and it traverses over rugged terrain, harsh spin effects, and several rather steep inclines as well. And being the desert, you have to go out there well hydrated. Very important. So let's have a look at Mount Zeal, and then we'll talk about it a little bit as well. So this is Mount Zeal. So as you can see from this map, location of Mount Zeal, Northern Territory, Australia, it's really in that same vicinity as Pine Gap. Now this picture here gives you a bit more of an idea. So on the right side of that photo, and the MacDonald Ranges runs through the middle horizontally, you can see Pine Gap. And even Alice Springs just makes it onto the edge of that screenshot I've taken. So you can see Alice Springs on the right-hand side. Then you can see Pine Gap down a little bit further, not far from Alice Springs. Now, if you look across to the left side of the picture and towards the upper part where the red dropper is, that's Mount Zeal. Now, I measured that distance last night, and it's about 140 kilometres between Pine Gap and Mount Zeal. So relatively speaking, they are fairly close to one another. Now, this is another almost funny picture, but it shows you the what the terrain is like in that area. It's very, very desolate, as you can see, harsh conditions. Not a place that you'd want to go to without having a lot of supplies with you. And apparently there's an intergalactic shopping mall 600 meters below your feet if you're standing in this location. So that's what Mount Zeal is all about. It's an alleged underground base so close to Pine Gap. Interesting that may be the case. But again, it's very hard to authenticate in any way about what's there. So if I was to go out to Pine Gap, which I hope to do one day, I would definitely take in Mount Zeal at the same time. It's alleged to have an alien base underneath it, as the sign says, but it's also meant to be part of a particular alien race that have that area. So this is where it starts to get, what would you say? You've got to take a leap of faith with what I'm going to say from this point forward. And this is only information that I've read about Mount Zeal. So it is an underground base, is an Anukai stronghold. Now, the Anukai, who may be from the Sirius star system, have a loose strategic alliance with the Draco Prime reptilians from the Draconius star system. This is the information that I'm reading, that I'm finding online. Both ET groups have timetabled this planet for invasion and takeover. Well, that sounds a rather serious situation. However, with the many positive ET races, including the Pleiadians, that are helping humanity, this is probably not going to happen. That'll counterbalance that attack. And so Mount Zeal is this deep base under the mountain where the Anakai apparently have their base here on Earth. So now this is kind of really getting out there, in my opinion, in terms of provability or even believability. I would say that you're getting into an area that's just not provable at this point in time to say that is an alien base out there. But who knows? I mean, I've never been out there. I mean, you can go and hike Mount Zeal, and it will, for all intents and purposes, appear to be an ordinary desert mountain. So, and you'll probably find no edges of where some door opens up in it either. So, and you've got to remember the conditions out there are fairly harsh too. So you need to be pretty fit to climb Mount Zeal in the first place. So you're going to want to be some type of a triathlete ability to get up there. And, are you going to see anything when you're there? No, probably not. But the rumours persist around Mount Zeal. You've got Pine Gap. They're both close to each other. UFO activity is reported in both locations and all around Alice Springs as well. There's many UFO reports, and one day I'll try and do an episode on, or focus on, probably not an episode, but I might be able to focus on some Alice Springs type of UFO encounters that have occurred as well. So we'll just see how that goes. But this picture surfaced a few years ago, and I don't know, it looks fake to me. I can't call this as being, at all reliable information, but I am reporting what I have found. So apparently this is a what's called a tall white, or a Nordic, height of 5 to 6.5 feet tall, weighing about 120 to 240 pounds. Eyes are human, although they look a bit orange. Blonde hair, pale skin. Sex is both male and female. Well, that's enigmatic. Do they mean there's both male and females, or the males and females hermaphroditic? And the location of the photo is Mount Zeal, Northern Australia. So, what can you make of that? It's, they say that they are taller than the average human and have a more muscular build than what most people are like. But in this age of CGI, you'd have to say anything is possible. So I approach everything to do with Pine Gap with a grain of salt. I really do. And Mount Zeal even more so, because, it's just so hard to verify any of that information about both locations. There's just not a lot out there. Is it worth a visit? I would say yes, absolutely. If you're in Australia and you've been to Alice Springs, then I would certainly take the trip down the highway to visit as far as you can drive, and probably start hitting, this sort of signs again. I would walk out, I would drive out to that point there. But as you can see, even at that point there, you can't see the base. It's in the distance, probably over that distant range, halfway up the sign. You can see that little range there of the mountains, the McDale Ranges. So I probably wouldn't, so you're probably not going to see a lot. But I mean, curiosity is a big thing. And I just would say that if you're in Australia and you're in Alice Springs area, go out to Pine Gap or get as close to it as you can. Have a look. If you're even more adventurous than that, you could go hike Mount Zeal. I think it'd be a great place to go camping out there at night. You'd probably see some amazing astronomy, and whatever else would be possible as well. So I hope you found this episode to be interesting. I certainly did in researching it. I thought, this is going to be a big, deep rabbit hole. It is a big, deep rabbit hole, but how much information is actually going to be available out there? And it's patchy and limited. So I've done the best with what I've been able to find on what is, a notorious defence facility here in Australia. So once again, thank you very much for joining me for this episode. And I look forward to seeing you again next week. Should be back home again, and hopefully the laptops will be functioning, and I might be able to look at doing Haunted Prisons Part 2, or we'll see what else comes up, whatever inspires me in between until we meet again. So until next time, have a great evening, and I'll see you soon.